So good evening to all of you, and well, good evening or good afternoon in whatever time zone you are. A warm welcome from University of Cologne and from, from the DGO, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Osteuropakunde, and our center in Cologne, our sub-center in Cologne, and as well the Kopelew Forum, which was so kind to help us with the organization. And I especially want to greet Tatjana Detmer, who is here with us and who announced our event. And thank you for this ongoing and very valuable cooperation that we have with the Kopelew Forum. Well, that's all of my tasks today. I just have to welcome you, and now I hand over to Laura Jäckl, who has organized all and everything and who will introduce and welcome our two speakers. We are very much looking forward to your presentations.
Yeah, a very warm welcome also from my side. My name is Laura Jäckl and I'm a doctoral researcher at the Institute for Eastern European Law and Comparative Law at the University of Cologne. And first of all, a technical remark. Please note that we are recording this event, and if you do not wish to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera when asking a question and make use of the possibility to ask your question via chat. Now let me introduce in alphabetical order our wonderful speakers of tonight, Kristen Ghodsee and Mitchell Orenstein, authors of Taking Stock of Shock, which was published this summer with Oxford University Press, and which was by far not their first publication about Eastern Europe and the transition process. Collectively, Kristen Ghodsee and Mitchell Orenstein have actually published 15 books and over 90 journal articles and essays in this field. Kristen Ghodsee is an award-winning professor of Russian and East European studies and a member of the graduate group in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She obtained her PhD at the University of California in 2002, and her research focuses on gender, socialism, and post-socialism. As an ethnographer, she has spent almost 25 years conducting fieldwork and research in Eastern Europe for that period. Kristen Ghodsee was a residential research fellow at numerous institutions, among them the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and also in Germany at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, the Imre Kertész in Jena, and at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock. Her articles and essays have been translated into over 25 languages, and her recent 2018 popular book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, has already had 13 foreign editions, including translations into languages of former state socialist countries in Eastern Europe. A very warm welcome to you, Kristen Ghodsee. Mitchell A. Orenstein is a professor and chair of Russian and East European Studies, also at the University of Pennsylvania, and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a Philadelphia-based think tank. He obtained his PhD at Yale University in 1996, for which he was awarded by the American Political Science Association for the best doctoral dissertation in comparative politics. Mitchell Orenstein's research focuses on the political economy of transition in Central and Eastern Europe, on pension privatization worldwide, on the role of ideas in economic policy reform, and on Russia's hybrid war on the West. His sole authored and co-authored works on the political economy and international affairs of Central and Eastern Europe have won numerous prizes. His recent book of 2019 is The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War, a study of how intensifying geopolitical conflict has shaped politics in the lands in between Russia and the West. A very warm welcome also to you, Mitchell Orenstein. We are very glad that you're here with us tonight. Now, just a few words on tonight's structure. Kristen and Mitchell will now present their book for about 25 to 30 minutes each, and there will be time for questions after the first part, and the overall discussion will take place in the end. So the floor is yours, Mitchell Orenstein.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to get started and Kristen will follow. I think we're each going to speak for approximately 30 minutes. And if I can ask the organizers to please hold us to that time, that would be wonderful. I'll try to hold myself as well. So first of all, thank you so much to Professor Nussberger and also to Laura Jekyll for organizing this event. We're really, really pleased to be here. Cologne is one of my favorite cities in Europe, and I'm really kind of devastated that I can't be there in person right now, but it's a pleasure to speak with you all. And I'm going to share my screen in one brief second so that you can see the presentation that I have for you with a lot of pictures and a lot of graphs and charts. I'm assuming everyone can see it now. Yes. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that Kristen and I, in a way, we didn't really intend to write a book together. As you can probably see from our introductions, we've both been in the field, as true, for 25 years or more, and really we started in studying the region, both of us, in 1990. And we happened to have been in Eastern Europe during the summer of 1990, but we didn't know each other at the time. In fact, we hadn't really crossed paths academically. And that's part of the story, I think, because what I'm going to tell you about is a story of how disciplines talk past one another in this field of East European studies. And we got to know each other really because she was hired into my department at Penn. As an anthropologist, we were looking for a more diverse interdisciplinary group. And we began talking initially about a lot of things. I mean, we had a lot in common, so we talked a lot about a lot of things. But one of the things that we really focused on was this blog post by Branko Milanovic that came out in 2014, For Whom the Wall Fell, that was very controversial. It was even written up in the New York Times. And it sort of showed that, and he's reiterated by the way, on Twitter just this week, I was following him, that East European economic transitions were a failure. That 20% of the countries at that time, as of 2013, were still below the real income level that they had in 1990. That's 23 years later, they were still behind where they were in 1990. 40% of the countries were not so terrible, but they still weren't growing as fast on average as the average rich OECD country. There were about 10% of countries that were kind of keeping up, and then only 30% of success cases, which included Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Poland, Belarus, interestingly. So we were looking at this and debating it, and just, you know, in this conversation, which was a polite conversation. In fact, Kristen and I have worked really well together throughout the whole process. Sometimes people ask me, how did you work together? It wasn't honestly very difficult, but we were having a conversation of difference, where, you know, respectful difference, where, you know, my impression was honestly that this blog post was exaggerated. It may have captured something, but it didn't seem to correspond with the experiences I had as a student, mostly of the Visegrad countries. My dissertation was on the economic transition in the Czech Republic and Poland. And I really, based on knowing those countries pretty well, thought, okay, there's something wrong with this. This transition has been much better than he's saying. Kristen, who's, I should say, Professor Ghodsee in this context, you know, her perspective was much more shaped by doing anthropological field work in the Balkans, primarily Bulgaria, but also elsewhere in Yugoslavia. And the experience of those countries was quite different, not to mention that we came from different disciplinary backgrounds, political science versus anthropology, political science tending to be closer to the international organizations and kind of one type of view about the transition, and anthropology being much more critical of mainstream economics. So to make a long story short, we realized that although we've been spending 25 years or 30 years together working in the same field of Osteuropäische Kunde, right, that we had such totally diverse experience, right, that we didn't even know, like we couldn't even really agree on what happened in the transition, right, after studying it for a couple decades. So we decided at that point, to write a book together, and our initial thought, this was our initial thought in the book. Our initial thought was that we would gather a bunch of data from different disciplinary fields, from economics, from sociology, political science, demography, and ethnographic data. And we would basically decide which of these stories was right. Was it true that there was a really positive result after 1989, or that there was a negative result? And you can see, interestingly, when we began to delve into this, we saw very quickly that there are two dominant narratives of the transition. One is a kind of what we call the JCurve transition, the JCurve narrative, where transition countries had a slight dip, like a Nike swoosh. They dipped down, but then they rose up later and everything's basically going fine. And by the way, why are we even talking about transition? Just forget about it. This happened so long ago, it's ancient history. The other perspective on transition, and you can see this registered in photos that you find online about East Europe, is a kind of disaster capitalism narrative that arises more from Naomi Klein's book on shock therapy, and really says that transition was foisted upon countries. The economic reforms were forced down their throats. They didn't have any choice. They suffered a lot. They lost all these guarantees from socialism. They became impoverished, and a lot of people died. And this has been one of the worst things that ever happened. So we realized that there was sharply polarized perspectives on transition, that these perspectives are not only embedded in different social science disciplines, but they're also highly politicized, which makes discussing them kind of difficult, because the JCurve narrative is deeply embedded in the Western international institutions, not to mention universities, that you hear it very frequently. It's the official discourse, and it's a story which is intentionally upheld by organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, by the European Union programs such as FARA. And then there's the disaster capitalism is equally politicized. It happens to feed into the Putin narrative. The 1990s were a total disaster. Everything was terrible. Now that's why you need a strong hand. That's why you need me there to sort of, resist Western influence and to protect people from the deleterious social policies that occurred at that time. So our question in the book really was, can these Janus-based perspectives be reconciled? Is it possible to have a consensus narrative? Which of these is right? And how would it guide policy for the future? Because I should say that we undertook this project partly in cooperation with some researchers at the World Bank, because our intention was to put together a narrative that would provide a more accurate picture for policymakers. So we set about, our method is we set about gathering data from different social science fields, from as much economic data as we could get our hands on, demographic, public opinion, ethnographic data, and really, I mean, we might have missed something, but we emphasized that data which was comparable and was available for all countries across the post-communist space for all years, ideally, but at least for all countries. And then our method was essentially, we want to triangulate the results. So we know that there are faults or maybe differences in perception of different fields, but we want to kind of piece them together and see if it makes sense, and then fit a narrative to that. So that was really our method. Surprisingly, this is the surprising conclusion of our research, is that we did not find a winner. We thought that one of these narratives would be the winner and one would be the loser. We did not find that. What we found is that we found really strong evidence in our data we collected, both for the JCurve perspective and for the disaster capitalism narrative. So I think right there, that is already kind of mind-blowing in a way. I mean, something we really didn't expect. But basically what you see is really contradictory developments after 1989, where some people in some countries, or some regions within some countries, experience a J-curve transition. So it's obvious that they have some difficulties at first, but then much better results after a time. But, and this is a big but, and maybe this is in a way the key story of the book, a majority of post-communist citizens experienced a depression greater than the Great Depression of the 1930s. So you think about all those things you learned about Germany in the 1920s and the hyperinflation. The post-communist region went through something much worse, and it lasted much longer. In fact, the post-communist recessions as a group are the most severe recession ever in modern history, according to the Madison Project, which analyzes historical economic data. Let me just say that again. This is the worst ever recession recorded in modern history among any group of countries. If you think about and I'll compare it to the Great Depression in a second, because we're mapping the US Great Depression. So sorry about that. I should also maybe put up the German crash in the 20s. But what you see in the Great Depression, which is the blue line here, is that the Great Depression bottomed out in year 4. So this is 1929, and this is 1933, okay? And the US economy lost about 30% of output. Starting in year 4, it began to grow, and by year 10, let's say, it was back to where it was before, and then of course exploded, with the beginning of the Second World War. The three other lines on this chart are the top 10 post-communist countries, which is mostly the Visegrad countries. I'll show you who they are in a second. And these are the countries mostly who joined the EU. This is the bottom 10 are the red line, and the median group, the other 9 or so, are in the yellow line. Okay. And what this shows, I think, very eloquently, is that the best performing post-communist countries did a little bit better than the Great Depression, but their economic trajectory was similar to the Great Depression. But the top 10, the bottom 10 worst countries off, by the time that we were studying, we ended our data collection, which was, I guess, in 2016 or something like that, still hadn't come back on average to the level that they had had in 1989. Okay, that is a 30-year recession. That's really more of a biblical time frame than anything else that's been seen in economic history. Okay, now let's just talk about the median group. The median group came back 17 years it took for them to reach the level of output they had in 1990. And look at their performance since then. It is not impressive. If you told people at the outset that, okay, you're going to lose 40% of your economy, it's going to stay bad for 17 years, and then in year 25, you're going to have a 20% better economy than you did before, how many people would take that bargain? I don't think very many, honestly. If you measure the size of the output loss underneath, like this is the status quo line, underneath that line, the post-communist recession in the worst off countries were something like 6 or 10 times greater than the Great Depression. So not to belabor a point too much, but just to say our technique again, so just to say that this is a very severe, so you have different countries and different people, this is looking at it at a country level, but you could also look at an individual level. Different people, different countries, different regions, different cities, different demographics are experiencing really good really good situation or really bad recession in the same place. And I think that's the challenge of understanding transition in a nutshell. It's like a kind of cognitive dissonance, right? We look at, all these wealthy people in Poland, for instance, and say, it's amazing, but we can't at the same time process very easily the fact that it's not amazing for a lot of people, in this transition time. The other thing that we're doing in terms of technique, and here I'm just reproducing a chart from the book. Again, we're trying to not just trust entirely the economic data, because as we can talk about, economists have raised a lot of questions about the economic data and said it's overblown and various things. But we actually try to, in the book, test it against other data. In this case, I'm just showing you homicide rates. This is the whole region average. homicide rate per 100,000. That's the sort of choppy line. And then the poverty rate, with it. And it sort of shows, this graph is intended to show that we can verify these terrible economic performances with demographic data. And then Kristen will talk more about public opinion and about ethnographic data in a second. But just to say that this is one way we're trying to say, and what you see is that the homicide rate more or less follows the same shape as the poverty rate, with poverty lagging a little bit. But essentially both show some sort of major chaotic disaster. And I'm going to show another thing because I'm just trying to give you global comparisons for a second. So I've just compared these recessions to the Great Depression, and that's a very interesting academic point. It helps us understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. In this chart, we compare the post-communist transitions starting from year zero. In China, that's 1979. In Vietnam, it's 1986. For the post-communist countries, it's 1989 or 91. And what we show here, and the Great Depression's in there too from 1929, what we show there is that we compare the post-communist countries to China and Vietnam, okay, which is sometimes done rhetorically in newspapers or something, but just to show that there are some countries at the same time which are having a post-communist transition, which does not result in a massive collapse of the economy. And that's China and Vietnam. So I'll come back to that maybe later if we can talk about that comparison. In the remainder of the time that I have left, which is I think about 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is show you a few more charts where we tried to visualize the changes. And again, not just looking at economic results, but also looking at some of the demographic data. And what we do in these charts is we analyze the depth and also the duration of the collapse for each indicator. We average the depth and duration to produce a country ranking. And then we show in green the good countries, red the bad countries, and yellow the okay countries, the median countries. So here we go. Here is the way things look. If you want to visualize where did particularly badly on economic indicators, it was really, you could sort of say it was the southern tier of the former Soviet Union. So Central Asia had a terrible economic collapse, much worse than Russia. We hear often about Russia. Russia was median in this group. Let me just repeat that again. Every horror story you've heard about Russia, it was only average compared to what happened elsewhere. Ukraine was much worse. Moldova was much worse. Serbia, where Milanovic comes from, was much worse. The Caucasus, Central Asia, and also Latvia, the country which is a member of the EU. However, the economic data do not correspond very well with other demographic data, interestingly. So this is not, we concluded, really entirely an economic collapse. The transition can be conceived of as three different types of major crises that occur simultaneously. One is an economic collapse. The second is a mortality crisis where people are dropping dead or dying early. And the third is an out-migration crisis in which people are just fleeing these countries, okay? Or dying and fleeing these countries. So if you look at the crude death rate, I think, again, against the economic indicators, a couple things are interesting. One is it predominantly is affecting the European former Soviet Union countries and Southeastern Europe. The Muslim Central Asian countries have a completely different, and I think, is that Kosovo there? I think that's Kosovo, have a completely different experience where they are the worst affected economically, but they don't drop dead. Okay? People are not dying at the same rate as they are. And look at the Visegrad countries. Visegrad countries, they're good actually on every indicator I'm going to show you. Okay. So the mortality crisis is distinct from the economic crisis, as is the migration crisis. So Russia, which does terribly on death rate, actually is an in-migration country at this time because many people are coming into Russia who are Russians from outlying republics. And the migration story is really one of Southeastern Europe because of proximity to the EU, because of the relative difference in economic performance of these countries vis-a-vis the EU that's why you see that huge flow of people into Austria, into Germany, into probably every other country in the EU. And again, those countries are not necessarily the worst affected. Their economies, in some cases, are pretty good, but it's just that relative difference and the proximity to Europe that sends them in. In terms of life expectancy, again, a slightly different story. Human Development Index, slightly different story. Okay, so population, this is population growth, which is like an overall, of everything going on in demography. And now I'll just show these charts. These are just charts with a couple of representative countries, median countries chosen, just to show the magnitude of the changes we're talking about. So Tajikistan increased its population to 2017, it looks like, by 70%. Well, Bulgaria, where Kristen has spent a lot of time, it sank by 20%, its population. These are massive differences, massive divergences. Okay. This is how, when you put all countries on the graph, the way it looks like that Central Asia is dramatically growing in population during this time, despite a bad economic performance. And then a lot of East European countries having dismal. In fact, these countries are the fastest shrinking countries population-wise in the entire world. There are not declines like this usually recorded in countries except for wartime. So that verifies the fact that there is a massive collapse in GDP. This is a representative country, Czech Republic, Czechia, that had a pretty good transition. This is Belarus, which strangely had a much better transition. It was deeper dip, but also rose faster. And then this is Kyrgyzstan, which is one of the countries that suffered immeasurably economically. And here's how the whole distribution looks like. Let's look at life expectancy. Life expectancy is an important indicator. In fact, arguably, I don't know, it corresponds a lot with public mood, we believe. If you feel like your life is, in most West European countries, most OECD countries, life expectancy has been going up gradually. Although I have to say in my own country, in the United States, life expectancy, in fact, has been dropping since 2014, which is one of the reasons I think that our country is in the midst of a significant political crisis. So I believe it's a kind of variable people feel in their everyday. But essentially, you have the good countries, the green countries and the yellow countries where, yeah, there's a dip, maybe. But basically, after a few years in life expectancy, things get pretty rosy for these countries. Mostly, a lot of East European countries have been improving their life expectancy, and in fact, even in some cases, catching up to West Europe. However, a country like Ukraine suffers a dramatic drop in life expectancy that is not really turned around until 2010. That's a good 20 years later. Again, that's a kind of devastation which is unimaginable. In fact, dissimilar even from wartime, which may be more severe, but much shorter in duration, and often followed by a baby boom. Death rate tells a kind of similar story where you have some countries which had an elevated death rate and then it went down and it's pretty good, and others that are still elevated 30 years later, in part probably because so many young people have left these countries. Net migration, another one. So there's some countries like Poland where there's been a gradual migration to Poland. Others where there's been a massive outflow of people followed by recovery, or not so much. In the case of Croatia, again, an EU member state, who suffered this like terrible demographic problem. Fertility, similar, where there's a huge collapse in fertility rates that has not been abated in countries like Armenia, but is significantly abated in countries like Czechia and Latvia. So Kristen's going to go further into this, and I don't want to steal her thunder, Kristen, but just to say that we also present a lot of data on public opinion. This particular chart shows a collapse in social trust that occurred with this sort of stripy lines here being 1989 and the darker lines being 2016. This is from EBRD data. The 1989 numbers are retrospective, so maybe a little suspect, but they show that basically there's only 3 countries where the percent of people who say that they trust generally other people in their country has not declined dramatically since 1989. So let me just draw to conclusions because I personally really look forward to your comments and questions and to Kristen's presentation. Here's our conclusions. We find both evidence of the J-curve and disaster capitalism narratives. We are not, unfortunately, able to exclude either of these narratives as being representative of one aspect of what happened in the transition. We find that transition cannot be collapsed into a discussion of the economic data alone. It's insufficient to really measure what is happening in countries. And we recommend in our book an inequality-based perspective, which says that, okay, we can reconcile these 2 different narratives about transition by saying, look, a significant proportion of post-communist people did really well. They did really well. We can see that in life satisfaction indicators. We can see that in economic performance. We can see that in life expectancy. There's many people who are doing really well and much better than they did in 1989. There's no doubt about that. Many of them are our friends, by the way. But at the same time, we can also see that others suffered. They suffered because they were in the wrong country. They were suffered because they had less education, because they were outside of urban areas, in poor areas. Maybe they didn't have linguistic skills. Maybe they just didn't really take off. Maybe they were more female than male. They had some characteristics, or either individual level or group characteristics, that meant that they were suffering the worst recession in the modern history of all countries, at the same time that their neighbors were doing amazingly well. And that is the damaging story of transition. And that is why I think we see this kind of anti-elite politics arising that we can talk about more in the questions. I know that was one of the reasons that people are interested in this topic, because this gives a really great background for understanding the rise of populist parties, why people are so discontent, even sometimes in places that appear to be doing really well. We argue that the region from a policy perspective needs a much more inclusive type of development, a development that is not only good for the 30% who have experienced that J-curve rise, but for the at least 50% of the population to enable democracy to move forward. We also argue from a historical perspective that transition will not be forgotten. A lot of people, as we were writing this book that we were speaking with, said, well, why are you even talking about transition? Transition's over. You know, it's not unimportant today. You know, and we would point out that transition has to be seen as one of the epochal shaping events of Europe in the 21st century. It is on a par of something of a disaster, on a par with the First World War, with the Second World War, with the Great Depression. It is a massive calamity for a lot of people. And as a result, these countries are going to be shaped by what happened in the transition. In the same way that US policy, for instance, on banks and many, many other things, Social Security and everything, is shaped by the memories of the Great Depression. So that is our pitch. I think that argument, by the way, is really good for those of us who study transition. And I want to hand that over to my colleague, Kristen Ghodsee, to continue.
Thank you so much, Mitchell, for your highly interesting talk. There is now the possibility for questions, if there are any at this point. Please feel free to use the Zoom hand function or to use the chat. And yeah, if there are no questions at this point, we will continue with Kristen's talk. And have the overall discussion in the end.
So there are no questions? I mean, please interrupt if you have something burning now. No, I think you're all too polite. Nobody? Okay. Oh, yes, there we go. Great.
Yeah, as you want to have questions, there's just one, and that was just a sort of a little obiter dictum that Mitchell said. You said it depends on being female or male. That's what you said about being successful or not. And my impression actually was, but that's more or less centered on Russia, that women were more successful in the original transition period, let's say in the 1990s. So when we look at the death rate, for example, the male death rate was much more sort of horrible than the one for women. And so that was just a minor aspect I just wanted to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll answer. Kristen will have much more to say about this topic, but I'll just answer that, that essentially you're right. So I hesitated to say this, but in the economic data, women on average do worse economically. So the data show that economically women are more impoverished, than men. But it's true in Russia and other places, men died more. And the reason I think that we maybe both agree about this is that essentially what was happening is that as the economic basis for livelihood fell away and people couldn't survive really in the structures they had before, men were much more prone to start drinking heavily and have risky behaviors that led to their death. Women were much more likely to tough it out, do whatever they needed to do to protect their families. And as a result, despite being poorer, they did not die. They stayed alive for their children, for their grandparents, for whoever they were taking care of, for cohabiting with. So I think that's the same story Kristen would tell, but probably more eloquently.
Well, I just also think that, and Eva Fodor has written about this in the Hungarian context, that women were also more flexible in terms of leaving the labor force and re-entering the labor force during the socialist period because of things like extended maternity leaves. And in some ways, and I've written about this in my very first book, The Red Riviera, men also generally tended to have more technical education and women tended to have foreign languages and more kind of what we would think of as white collar skills. So in some cases and in some classes of women, they were better prepared for the transition because they were willing to deal with the kind of flexibility and insecurity of the crazy labor market of the 90s. And they had some skills that were valuable in the new capitalist economy. But overall, as Mitchell said, when we do the aggregate, and of course, you've got to remember, we're looking at 27 countries over 30 years. When you do the aggregate, women are much worse off. But there are certainly, and that's why the inequality perspective is so important. Some women, especially educated urban women, did actually very well relative to men. And that's certainly the case when it comes to mortality. Tatiana.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Many data are new. I would like to ask a question about the natural resources, about the role of the natural resources which different countries possess. I mean, they're very different, and Russia, of course, has lots of natural resources, oil, gas, gold, and so on and so forth. So my question would be, what is the connection, what is the correlation between the transition and the natural resources, excuse me. What role do they play? Have they any influence on transition? What is their effect, in other words?
That's a great question. I'll take that because I'm doing some additional research on it. But let me just first state, in our book, and this is something important for us to explain that I didn't explain at the outset, we do not look at all at the causes of whatever happened during the transition. We don't look at the causes. We only look at the sole focus of our book is what happened. Because again, we don't agree about that. There's no social science general agreement about that. So we're looking only at what we call in political science the dependent variable, right? We're looking at just what happened. And we decided not to look at causal explanations because, frankly, that's a whole very complicated and interesting debate. But if we started saying what we thought about that, we thought that we would be open to more criticism and people wouldn't pay any attention to the, what we're finding about what happened in the transition. Now, in a subsequent paper, I am delving deeply into that issue, and I'll tell you some surprising results. So, of course, natural resources do matter a lot. This whole region is very heavily dependent region. It's a developing region where natural resources are vitally important for countries. And it's something that the reform programs missed. Overall, yes, a lot of papers are showing that natural resources is driving economic development in these regions, and that economic reform programs did not drive growth. Let me just repeat that again. The speed of your economic reform or the depth of your economic reform is no longer an indicator of how well performing your economy is. That has not had a long-term impact at all. Okay. Natural resources and geography are found to have much more impact in most recent research, but I'm going to leave that aside, that whole discussion aside, except for this, just because that isn't really our focus in the book. We're just trying to create a narrative of what happened, and then to encourage people like yourself to sort of take these dependent variables and try to think about why this happened. I mean, honestly, there's two major explanations. One is that it's communism. Communism screwed everything up, right? And these countries are terrible because of communism, and they had to pay. And then there's another one, which is that neoliberal economic reform screwed everything up. And everything was absolutely terrible because of neoliberal economic reforms. We're just not able to say, honestly, which is which. I mean, obviously, there are important debates about that, but I don't know that we have a definitive conclusion about this. So.
Thank you. Are there any more questions at this point? If not, I would hand over to Kristen for the second part.
Okay, great. Hold on, let me, I gotta go back to my, okay, there we go. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen here. Okay, if I say share screen, yep, there we go, share, okay. Boom. Whoa, okay, here we go, taking stock of shock. All right, so I'm going to build on everything that Mitchell already told you, but one of the things that I really felt was important for this talk that we're giving today is that Eastern Germany, because it disappeared as an independent country, is not included in our analysis. In most of the economic data, in most of the demographic data, in most of the data where we have independent, sources from the World Bank or the EBRD, Eastern Germany just sort of ceases to exist. And so one of the things that I wanted to do in my part of the presentation is to try to bring the Eastern German experience into this narrative. Because when Mitchell is showing you those charts of the top 10, the bottom 10, and the median 10 of these countries that we studied, and we really went out of our way to get as much data as we could, it was very, very difficult to get data on Eastern Germany because of the reunification in 1990. So, as Mitchell said, we've both worked in this region for a really long time. And we were both quite young Americans traveling in Eastern Europe in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. In fact, I'm going to show you a very embarrassing photograph of me. Whoops. This is in East Berlin. I am 19 years old. And for some reason, I decided to make this walk like an Egyptian pose in front of this poster for Perestroika, where there's this quote about fear must disappear from the earth. And those of you who are old enough, and I'm really dating myself now, but if you're old enough to remember the 80s, you will know that nuclear annihilation was a serious fear that many of us lived with as a possible outcome of the Cold War. I mean, for younger people, you're thinking now about climate change, but for us, it was what was once called mutually assured destruction. And, you know, during this period of time of reform in the Soviet Union and, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall and then the fall or the 1989 revolutions, we have Mr. Germany, what Time magazine called him, Helmut Kohl in 1990, telling the people of Eastern Germany and more broadly, the people of Eastern Europe, that no one will be worse off than before, but it will be much better for many. And I'm not going to like brutalize you with my terrible German pronunciation, but you can see the quote there in German. And I think it's really important here that this is kind of an implicit promise that no one will be worse off than before, okay? And that the story that we're telling in this book, as it applies to the German experience, is a story about this quote and the reverberations of this quote in terms of the data that we're finding in Eastern Europe more broadly. All right. So I'm sorry, for some reason, my presentation is, yeah, there we go. All right, so this is a quote from the East German director of the privatization agency, talking about the transition process in Eastern Germany. The present privatization process is also characterized by grave labor difficulties. Although the enterprises of the Treuhand presently employ 2.1 million people, compared to 4 million 1 year before, some 400,000 will have to be dismissed by the end of 1991. Their official dismissal will mean that unemployment in East Germany could go up to 40% by the end of the year, 40% unemployment. And he admitted in 1991 that West German industry has mainly used privatization to broaden its production base and gain access to a new market of 16 million consumers. That generally speaking, the transfer of East German industries and East German lands, the former property of the East German state, into the hand of the Treuhand was basically a way of West German industry using privatization to broaden its base and gain access to a consumer market that had previously been untapped. So one of the things that you see in Eastern Germany in the immediate aftermath of the reunification is this idea of rust in peace, this idea of the decimation of the East German industrial base. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this narrative, so I don't have to go into it. It's a narrative, by the way, that is very relevant to my own country, where we also have these big Rust Belt towns where industries have left and gone abroad to Mexico or China or Vietnam, leaving behind these rotting factories and many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of men who are now unemployed, who previously had jobs in the industrial sector. So one of the things I think is really interesting when we think about the situation of transition, and again, I think that this J-curve narrative and this disaster capitalism narrative, as Mitchell said very clearly, they coexist at the same time. They can both be true. And the reason they can both be true is that one of them is true for one part of the population and one region, and the other is true for a different part of the population and a different set of regions. And so the key thing in 2014, for the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Washington Post published a series of graphs that I think are really interesting to look at. So the data is from 2013, so it's a little bit out of date, but what you can see here is the unemployment rate, higher with the darker blue, lower with the white and the lighter blue, between the former East Germany and West Germany. You can also see the rate of disposable income, darker blue being more disposable income, and the white or light blue being less disposable income. It very clearly breaks down along the lines of the two former republics. Demographic, this is the percentage of young people among the total population. So as I said, when we put together the tables for the book, one of the big blind spots that we had was Germany, because the Eastern, there just weren't data. It wasn't being collected in quite the same way. But you can see here quite clearly, demographically speaking, there was a massive migration of young people out of the former Eastern Germany into Western Germany. This is also life satisfaction. And of course, it's self-reported, so you have to take the data with a grain of salt when you ask public opinion questions about life satisfaction. What you could see here is very clearly between 2012 and 2016, as self-reported on a scale of 0 to 10, where the darker green is the 10 and the yellow is the 0, this is self-reported life satisfaction between East and West Germany. And I think, again, it's really interesting that these divisions continue to persist. So when we talk about mortality, we often think about the mortality crisis in Russia, the mortality crisis in the Ukraine, the mortality crisis in Belarus, and in these very heavy drinking countries of the former Soviet Union. But in fact, there was also a pretty significant mortality crisis in Eastern Germany. This is from a working paper series that was published in 2016. In 1998, researchers confirmed increased mortality rates for East Germans between 89 and 90 and attributed these excess deaths to, quote, drastic social, political, and economic changes that took place during the transition from the socialist to the market economy. The German authors found the rise in deaths from alcoholism, heart and circulatory problems, and suicide causally related to the reunification process, mostly among middle-aged men, which comes back to this question about women versus men. Thousands lost their lives prematurely from the quote unquote psychosocial stress that was associated with the transition. And so this also maps on to exactly what Mitchell was talking about in terms of male life expectancy, right? If we look at the situation in Russia, you can see that there is a dip in Russia, but suddenly in the 90s, there's this massive plunge, slight increase, and then the ruble crisis kind of plunges it back then. So there are these lives that are just wiped out because of the psychosocial stresses associated with the transition process. This is an economic, again, a working paper by Richard Easterlin, published in 2008, quote, a visiting economist from Mars, confronted only with GDP data, might well conclude that an economic disaster on the scale of the Great Depression had befallen some 400 million of the world's population. Now, what I find really interesting about this quote is that this paper has been circulating for quite a long time, but it's really only, I think, recently that people are fully appreciating that, in fact, it really was as bad as the Great Depression. Mass privatization, this was an incredibly controversial paper that was published by Lawrence King and David Stuckler. This question of whether or not mass privatization was causally responsible for the mortality crisis. Again, as Mitchell said, in our book, we tried to avoid the causal explanations just because we really wanted to talk about what actually happened. But it's important to point out that, and this is a quote from this working paper here, countries in the mortality belt, spanning from Estonia in the north to Ukraine in the south, experienced life expectancy declines up to 6 years within the first half decade of reform. A peacetime mortality crisis unparalleled in modern history. To put this in perspective, eliminating all common forms of cancer corresponds to a life expectancy increase of approximately 3 years, a little less than half of the magnitude of Russia's mortality experience. The United Nations MONI project tabulates that excess mortality during the 1990s, or deaths that would not have occurred if mortality had remained at 1989 levels, totaled 3.2 million. This crisis is in no respects over. 15 years after transition, 11 out of 25 of the post-communist countries had failed to recover to pre-transition levels of life expectancy. So I mean, just again, let that sink in for a second. Eliminating all forms of cancer would only gain you about 3 years of life expectancy, which is half of what the Russians lost in the transition period. This is this paper about large-scale privatization, death rates in ex-communist countries. Again, the authors show that implementation of neoliberal-inspired rapid large-scale privatization programs, what they call mass privatization, was associated with significant declines in life expectancy, as well as greater alcohol-related deaths, heart disease, and suicide rates. The authors interpret these findings as evidence that rapid organizational reform creates excess psychosocial stress, which, consistent with the public health literature, increases death at the individual level. So even the EBRD, and I think it's really important, again, we based a lot of our own data on the EBRD life and transition surveys, which were done in 3 waves. They asked a pretty broad selection of questions. It was a really well done survey. You know, there are some methodological issues, but overall, they tried to survey the entire post-socialist region over these 3 different waves. And even the EBRD, which, by the way, had an invested interest in spinning the narrative of the J-curve transition, that it was bad for a while, but then it got better. In 2016-17, they actually did a report called The Impact of Transition on Wellbeing. And in their own report, they say that those born at the start of transition, so these are people that were born around 1989 in Eastern Europe or around 1991 in the former Soviet republics, are on average 1 centimeter shorter than those born before or after those transition years. And that height difference reflects factors like stress and malnourishment, and that is comparable to growing up in a war zone. Now, these screenshots that I'm showing you are taken from the EBRD's own website. These are not my graphics, these are their graphics, to basically emphasize that you can actually see the effects of the transition on the bodies of the babies that are now 30 years old, in most cases, between 30 and 32. In most cases, you can see that they're literally shorter on average than cohorts born before or after these key transition years. As Mitchell pointed out, part of this is the result of increased poverty and deprivation. And this is especially severe material deprivation. So there are different ways of measuring poverty. And one of the things that we get into with economists is how you measure poverty, whether people had Black or gray economies that were supporting them in terms of caloric intake. But what we know from the Eurostat data is that severe material deprivation, and this is 2014 and 2015 data, is still much greater in the East than it is for comparable countries in the West. As Mitchell also pointed out, the fastest shrinking countries on Earth are in Eastern Europe. This is a graph that was put together by the Financial Times, showing that by 2050, it's possible that Bulgaria will lose yet another 23% of its population. So I think we're talking about a demographic death spiral in this part of the world, not only as a result of increased mortality, also as a result of decreased fertility, but mostly, especially in the EU countries, as a result of outmigration. So this is another chart from the Financial Times that shows that Eastern Europe, this is the quote, the title of the article is the largest population loss in modern history. We have never seen the rate of population decline in modern history as we have seen in Eastern Europe in the last 30 years. So since the 1990s, according to some sources, over 20 million young people have migrated from Eastern to Western Europe looking for better opportunities. Many of these young people now live in the West. They have much better lives than they would have had in Eastern Europe. But what has been left behind is the kind of psychosocial catastrophe of these economies that are basically with older populations, graying populations, and very little workforce of people of prime working age to support the social safety nets and the pension funds of these elderly people. So where I do most of my work in post-socialist Bulgaria, what you see are completely abandoned villages and depopulation. I know that in some parts of former Eastern Germany, you also have pretty severe depopulation in some of the more rural areas, certainly of young people. But in Bulgaria, it's like absolutely abandoned. They're literally, this article calls them ghostly Bulgaria. They're ghost towns. Nobody is left. You would walk into them, these villages, and think that some kind of murderous plague had hit the village. But in fact, people have either just migrated out or they've died. One of the things that we do talk about in the book, even though we try very hard to avoid the causal explanations to explain exactly what was going on and whether things could have been done differently, Mitchell showed you these charts about Vietnam and China, who also had post-communist transitions, but they were much less painful for the people in the country. I think one of the things that's really interesting in the German context, and I really would love to have, I'm sure many of you have opinions on this, is the effect that the bitterness of the way that the transition process was handled in Germany has impacted domestic politics in Germany. So this is a banner from the local elections in Leipzig from the AfD in 2019. And you can see that they're actually using the term Wende, having yet another turn, another change, to draw support for their political party in Leipzig. This is in Brandenburg in the summer of 2019. The East stands up, take back your land. There's an incredible sense of frustration among many East Germans about the way that the transition was handled. And I think that has really interesting political reverberations to this day. And it's not only among the right. This is a poster from Brandenburg as well, from the summer of 2019. This is Die Linke. And I think that the key thing here is to come back to that initial Helmut Kohl quote that I put up, that many will be better off than before, but it will be much better for most, right? For many people. No one will be better for four, but it will be much better for many. And in fact, what has happened in many of these post-socialist countries, when we look at the data, and not only the economic data, but also the demographic data, also the public opinion data, and certainly the ethnographic data, is that in fact, in many ways, what happened is that many are worse off than before, but it will be much better for a few. And indeed, when we sort of kind of step back from the book and really think about what's going on in these pages, and I do think it's interesting that Branko Milanovic very recently tweeted out that if you look at the numbers, I actually should have put that tweet in the presentation. If you look at the numbers, just from an economic point of view, the story is still pretty bleak, right? I think at the end of the day, we have to accept that probably about, really ballpark rough estimates, about 30% of the former socialist world, these 27 countries, which by the way excludes Eastern Germany, but let's just throw Eastern Germany or former Eastern Germany into that, about 30% of the population is much better off by far. They live lives, they have standards of living and life expectancy and access to consumer goods and access to international travel pre-pandemic. All of the things that capitalism and liberal democracy promised, they have it. And as Mitchell also said, and I think it's really important for those of us who live in the United States and do our work in Eastern Europe, many of these people are our friends. Many of these people are precisely the people who've done well and have international networks of scholars and move in international circles and go to international conferences and publish in English and all of the things that we, that the intellectual exchanges are often with the 30%. However, there is this other population. Much of it is rural, much of it is less educated, much of it is concentrated in certain parts, geographically parts that are less linked up with international networks in the West and less linked up with the European Union. And as Mitchell points out, and as Branko Milanovic showed in his blog post, For Whom the Wall Fell, there are still many people living in the post-socialist region in 2021. I think we're like 3 weeks away from 2022, who still don't have the standard of living that they had in either 1989 or 1991. And that to me is a really important story. And in the chapters on ethnography and in the chapters on public opinion, all of that story, those voices are represented in the book. And they come out and they tell us that, exactly as Mitchell said, transition is an epoch-defining experience, like World War I, like World War II, like the Great Depression. For so many people, they're still living in the economic fallout of the transition or the political reverberations of this transition in their daily lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for your thought-provoking talk. The floor is now open for questions and comments. And I'm happy to take your questions if there are already some. Otherwise, I might go first with a question. And I would be interested, you really used this interdisciplinary approach and combine different methods and look at it from very different perspectives. And I would be curious what the resonance was that you got for your book, also in different scientific communities. Did it enhance the interdisciplinary dialogue and discussion that you were hoping for? Or, is it maybe still too early to tell? And what are your thoughts on that?
So I actually think the book just came out, so it's still kind of too early to tell. But I don't know, Mitchell, if you want to talk about the review we got in the American Conservative, right? So one of the very first reviews we got was completely in a place that we were not expecting to get a good review from, right? And I think, and then that review in the American Conservative of all places, then got translated into Russian, which I also think is quite interesting. So, but in terms of the actual kind of interdisciplinary dialogue, can anthropologists talk to sociologists, talk to demographers, talk to economists, talk to political scientists? I think it's still too early to tell. I think what Mitchell and I were doing was, I don't know, Mitchell, you can completely disagree with me if you want, but we have a really easy relationship. We would talk in the hall, our offices were down the hall from each other. We could kind of work through things on a very personal level. This was pre-pandemic, obviously. And I think that the nature of our collaboration was pretty unique because even though we were both very much coming from our respective disciplines, we had a lot of interest in common. We had a lot of questions in common. We worked really well together. And so we were able to kind of put all the pieces together in a way that I think is pretty rare across economics, political science, sociology, anthropology, and demography, right? And when we tried to have a conference in November of 2019, again, I think it was just moments before the pandemic, right? We had this big conference where we brought people up from the World Bank and we had an interdisciplinary group of scholars. it wasn't really easy for them to talk to each other in the way that it was easy for Mitchell and I to sort of talk to each other and kind of hash these questions out. So, I mean, I'm hoping that the book kind of represents a possibility for future interdisciplinary research in the social sciences that we don't really have very good models of right now. I don't know, Mitchell, if you want to add to that.
I would agree entirely. I mean, I think that it's really hard to tell. Honestly, I feel like it's going to take a few minutes for people to think this through and to decide whether they need to respond to this, right? Because in a way, you know, does an economist need to respond to this? I mean, the economists I discuss with would rather just not read the book, honestly. And you know, and we're going to see who reads it. I don't know. You know, we've been getting quite a good reception in Europe. We have a number of talks, such as this one, where we're speaking to a lot of different diverse research communities, often East European studies, I think. It will definitely take off on, you know, so, but I don't know. I mean, I think we'll see when the reviews come in, who decides they love it or hate it. And yeah, it's still too early.
One thing I think that we should say, which Mitchell didn't mention, is that all of our data, all of the data that we used is online on our website, takingstockofshock.com. So the other thing that's really important here is that we're not hiding anything. Everything is available. That it's a one huge Excel file that you could download with every single number that we use to create the tables and the charts in our book. So I think that's the other thing that's really important, is that we're being really transparent about the data sources that we have used. And I think that, you know, people may disagree with us for all sorts of reasons, but I don't think they're necessarily going to be able to impugn our data sources because we've posted them online and we've taken them from really legitimate places, like the Madison Project, like the EBRD, like the World Bank. So that's the other thing that I think that's really unique about this, is that we've really, it's like, if you're an empiricist, this is like an empiricist's smorgasbord of data. We have so much data from so many different sources that we've shoved together and put on the website, so that whatever questions you have, you can go in and actually work with that data if you'd like to.
Yeah, it's takingstockofshock.com. And another just add is that the thing that surprised us so far about the reaction has been that we got more political reaction than we expected. So we got a really positive, nice review from American Conservative, and we got a really positive and nice review from Social Europe. And so far, those are the two reviews we have. So we're happy about that. We don't know what that means.
Thank you so much. Well, and that's encouraging to hear your experience in working together interdisciplinary. Yeah, there's a question from Lorenz Vilenga.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your interesting talks, which were both very, very thought-provoking and fascinating. Professor Orenstein, you pointed out how there is evidence actually for both narratives. So for the JCurve on the one hand and for the disaster capitalism approach or transition on the other. And Professor Ghodsee, you pointed out that 30% of the population, if you speak very broadly, is better off now, 30 years after the transition. And I was wondering, could you elaborate a little more on the other 70%? Is it possible to say anything about the proportions there? Are these people in general worse off, or perhaps their living standard didn't change that much?
I think that, you know, it's a great question. Those are just like our rules of thumb, you know, that I guess you would say that maybe, you know, there are 30% that are decidedly better off, and no one would ever have a question about that, right? And then the thing is that if you have a recession that lasts for 25 or 30 years, and even if you're better off today, which probably most people are better off today, you know, slightly, but you've suffered this recession for 25 years, you know, I guess the question would be, are you better off overall? Like, did you lose things during that 25 years? I think that's one of the pieces that's hard to understand about the transition, is because it lasted so long, it had like all sorts of devastating consequences on people's social relationships, stress, their confidence in their country. One thing that we didn't really mention, but we have a whole chapter in the book, is, well, I did mention the loss of social trust, the loss of political trust. We just did a short op-ed piece together about COVID vaccination rates, which are extremely low in East Europe, and related it to this transition that, people lost trust in government. And so now when they say, oh yeah, we're coming to vaccinate you, they're like, what's your problem? You must be like doing some work for like some international pharmaceutical company. And no, you can't put microchips in my body, And, so it's done a lot of things. And I guess, I don't know, is that person, who's totally lost confidence, they probably are at a slightly higher material standard today than they were before. But they're also kind of have, having had lived through that 20, 30-year period. So I guess it's a little hard to say, but I guess we would say that decidedly there's 30% who really seem to have benefited. And that's important also when you look at the politics of countries, even like the successful cases. So you would think, like, for instance, in Poland or something, just to take an example, that people would all be much happier and therefore they'd be voting for mainstream parties. Well, guess what? They're not, And the reason is very simple, is because even in the successful countries, if you look more in detail, and public opinion polls are saying, it wasn't until 2005 that more polls said that their family situation was better now than in 1989, than before, right? So, and it's not really until very recently that a majority of polls, like that there's way more polls, who feel better off than feel the other way, right? That they were worse off, right? Or indifferent, basically. So you have like a lot of people, when you look at economic averages, even in a particular country, that covers up a lot, because an average could be the same. Average GDP growth could be the same if one person has everything and everybody else have nothing, right? Or if there's an equal distribution. And so we often look at like averages and say, oh yeah, on average, everybody's doing better there, not realizing that inequality has grown so much that actually a majority of people may have stagnated. Maybe they didn't go down, but they didn't do better. And that phenomenon is well known in the United States, that we've had stagnant wage growth, for 30, 40 years under neoliberalism. And a lot of people have done extremely well and other people badly. And that's sort of the story in East Europe as well. And I think it helps, again, to describe some of the politics. So yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that was just a rule of thumb, but I suppose we'd have to get more precise to really.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that, I think it's really important to point out that, consumer shortages and travel restrictions, right? And political oppression and the secret police, like all of these things are really bad, right? And when they go away, it's good, right? We're not saying anything about that, right? And that for many people who lived under those systems, all of those things are seen as net positives, right? I can go to Paris now. What the problem is that most people can't, first of all, most people can't afford to go to Paris, right? And if you're not in the EU, you may not be allowed to go to Paris, right? So there's a whole nother set of rules, and Leah Upi just published a wonderful book called Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, about Albania, and how during the 80s, if you were an Italian and you managed to flee, if you were an Albanian and you managed to flee into Italy, you were considered a hero. But after 1991, if you got on a boat to try to cross the Adriatic to go to Italy, they were like trying to shove, you were a criminal, right? So it was like overnight, freedom of movement became, went from being like a human right as far as the West was concerned to becoming like, we need to put up as many walls as possible to prevent these Albanians from coming to our shores. So I think that, so it's really important to understand the difference between liberal freedom and a kind of social and economic freedom, which are two very complicated and vexed concepts. And we do not go into this in the book because it's like way beyond the purview of the book that we were writing about the actual just sort of concrete situation. But I think the other thing is, and I have really thought, I've spent like a lot of the last 3-4 months in Eastern Europe, And I've been thinking a lot about, look, if 30% are doing pretty well, that's actually really good by Western standards, right? Because in the United States, our inequality is so bad that like the 1% is doing way, way, way better, right, than the rest of the population. And so the fact that 30% are doing pretty well is actually not that bad, given that you live in a country which once had the Gilded Age. You know, like we live in a country that's like founded on genocide and slavery. So like, it's okay, right? Generally speaking, for us to live in these vastly unequal circumstances because we're just sort of used to it. But I think the thing is, and we do say this at the end of the book, there is there's this interesting test that economists, behavioral economists, like to do this test about splitting gifts, and the ultimatum game, it's called. And one of the things that these behavioral economists consistently find is that East Europeans consistently report a lower threshold of tolerance for inequality. Like if you were born in the West and you were raised in the West under a capitalist system, like inequality is just sort of a fact of life. It's just something that you kind of accept. Whereas in Eastern Europe, it's very clear that there's a higher tolerance for inequality. And it's exactly what Mitchell said in his part of the presentation. It's awful if your standard of living is declining. It really is. But it's not as awful if everybody around you also is having a standard of living that is declining, as it would be in a war. Like during the First World War, the Second World War, everybody is sort of in the same boat. The problem with the and in the Great Depression, by the way, you had all these billionaires, you know, millionaires jumping off of buildings because they'd lost all of their savings in the stock market crash. The problem with the transition, I think, sort of cognitively, is that you had a very elite part of the population that did super, super, super well. They really thrived. And I'm not even talking about like the oligarchs, right, who like basically managed to amass all of the previously held assets. I'm also just talking about people who happened to have the right education, the right networks, lived in urban areas, had access to certain kinds of resources, and just really managed to make the most out of their lives after the transition. Or the young people who left and, you know, now have wonderful lives in France or Great Britain or Germany or wherever. And if you happen to be one of the people who's downwardly mobile, and your neighbor, right, or the mayor of your town is one of those people who's like super upwardly mobile, it's the vast difference in inequality. It's the vast divergence of life paths that fuels this psychosocial stress and anxiety that I think is ultimately responsible for not only the mortality crisis, also the declining fertility and the massive outmigration. So, I mean, I've just been in Bulgaria and Serbia, and, you know, just listening to the narratives of people who really tried to stay and are now willing to abandon their kind. Like, it's never going to get better. It's never going to fix itself. It's, you know, I need to do like everybody else who has a brain and get out of this country and never come back. This is a kind of it's like a profound rot that ends up in society, and it is the result of the way that the transition played out in a lot of these countries, not all of them, and not for all people. And that's what I think is really important about our book, that we show that some people did really, really well. But the fact that some people did really well and others did really poorly exacerbates the anxieties and frustrations of those who did not do well.
Thank you. Thanks for making that so clear again. Angelika Nussberger.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting discussion. And also what you just last said, I can just confirm, but it's not only in the transition, it's already before. I mean, the background is so important, because in communism, it was really, you had your square meters measured out for everybody. So you knew you would have your, I don't know, 15 square meters per person or something. And even those who were really rich or well off were comparatively poor. I remember being invited to the former house of this horrible Enver Hoxha in Albania, who was the dictator. And when you come to that, that's like a one family house in a well-off villa in the suburbs, but not more. It's not a palace. And so this equality that they knew before, this relative equality, where the fact of getting ham was already a privilege, that was the background. And then this start of the scissors, I mean, that was so remarkable. But my question, I have two questions. One is concerning the 30% you are talking about. So these 30%, first question, do they include those who leave? Because you are talking about many who leave, and they are well off for sure, who study, who don't come back. But do you think there are 30% staying back and still well off? And the second question concerning linked to those 30%, and you mentioned yourself the oligarchs. I mean, that's a phenomenon that's absolutely crazy. You have these billionaires and this absolutely completely, I mean, incomparably rich people who make the others, I mean, who explain a lot why a lot has developed as it has developed. And I'm wondering, these 30% still are not sort of equal. So these 30%, you have 0.5, which are having enormous amount of money. So there I see still a sort of a very different pattern. But my other question concerns now what we are very much interested in at my institute, democracy. So, and there, your data about out-migration are just stumbling. I mean, we know it somehow, but when you show it, how especially Bulgaria or other countries are losing their population. And I'm wondering in how far this fact sort of explains to some extent why there is not much pressure for change in these countries. They don't really build up democracy, because it seems to me those who are so fed up with what's happening, they just leave. And then you don't have this pressure to change your own country, but your revolution is much easier to accomplish by walking over the border. And that's for me a sort of an explanation, this out-migration that changes what would normally happen if people are unhappy with their systems. They would fight to change, fight for change, but they don't have to, because they just leave and have everything they want. And I think that's different from other time. Thank you.
Kristen, if you don't mind, I'll take the first one and you take the second question about democracy migration. So, you know, I think that one point that we didn't really make in this presentation that I would like to talk about now regarding this 30% is that we tend to perceive this 30% to be the majority of people, right? Because they're more visible. And I think you hit on one of the reasons that is because those are the people who left. The people who left, by and large, are among West Europe, right? They're among us, right? And we see them and we see that they're doing well. And the people we would typically interact with if we go to those countries are also usually among the successful group. And also those 30% are heavily in the Visegrad countries, which is Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary. In other words, those countries that are much closer to Western Europe, Slovenia, right? And so, I mean, if I ask for a show of hands in the audience, how many people have been to Czechia? You know, raise your hand. Okay. And then if I ask you, how many people have been to Georgia? Raise your hand. Okay, pretty good, but still less, you know, half. You know, so the thing is that what we're dealing with in the book is that there's a visible group of people who are doing well. And then there's kind of like an invisible group. And some of these questions are like, who are these people, right? You know, and so I'll just talk about some of the people. We had a discussion with a Georgian podcast in Georgia. And I personally have never been to Republic of Georgia. I'd love to go. I see somebody who's from Georgia here. But, you know, Georgia is a country which is talked about in the international organizations as being like a model country. right? How many people have heard that? Where Georgia is like a model economy, right? It had these amazing reforms. Now everything's so great. It has this fast growth rate. And I'm here to tell you that Georgia is actually one of the worst performing economies in the whole post-Soviet space, that it has had a tremendous outmigration, right? That it has a deep social crisis, deep economic crisis. And although it is true that it's been growing a lot, it lost 60% of its economy. It really didn't have, much place to go but up. Many people in Georgia, the people we're talking about in this conversation, we were, I don't know how we got on this topic, we were talking about sociability and the connection with economic relations. And we were told an interesting story that stuck with me, that one of the issues of organizing people to speak up in democracy in Georgia is that they really aren't into socializing very much. The poor people don't like to socialize because apparently in Georgia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's traditional if you go to visit your neighbor or friend that you bring something along with them, like some cookies or pastry or something like that as a gift, right? And once people became too poor to even afford like a box of cookies to bring to their neighbor, they actually stopped talking to each other. They stopped seeing each other as much, right? So basically, it is a little hard to see these people. Sometimes we do see them, but we don't see them, right? How many people know that there are poor people in East Europe? We know that, but we don't like somehow cognitively focus on that, right? We can, all sorts of things become, clear if you sort of admit to yourself that there's some people doing well and some people doing badly. Often we see this all around us, but just those people have tended to be invisible more in our narratives, but also invisible in public spaces, invisible in being in very far-flung areas that no one's been to, like Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, or, and invisible in, their kind of own reluctance to kind of participate. I mean, one of the things we get into in the book is that from the ethnographic standpoint, is a lot of people who felt like who were sinking. They were sinking. They felt like it was their own fault in a lot of ways, because the dominant narrative was telling them that, if you're productive enough and resourceful enough, you'll make it in a capitalist economy. And they were like, well, I'm not that kind of person. I'm just sinking, And as a result, they didn't feel justified in talking about it, even to their family. A lot of times, they just felt like, you're a loser. You're a loser. It's your fault that you're a loser. It was pretty much the narrative people got. And so that's why, again, this relationship with the populist reaction, right, is the populist is sort of taking people who have felt like nobody was listening to them and said, here's your voice, and giving them a voice, which is kind of pride, in a way, a pride of, what do we call it? The nationalism of despair, which we take from a phrase we take from Sergei Ushakin. That there's this, we're actually together. We have a common identity based on suffering, right, in the transition, which of course is, common in this area. But that's kind of the reality we're at. We're starting to hear from some people that honestly, we didn't really think about too much before. So thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, so the cover of the book is actually a photograph that I took in Bucharest in Romania in 2012. And we were visiting a church, and it's like a beautiful Orthodox church in the center of Bucharest. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting, as I was, I had a camera and I was sort of standing on the street, kind of taking pictures around. And I turned around and I was taking photographs. These are actually some of my colleagues up here on the in front of the church. Was this guy. I actually hadn't noticed him until I was looking at him through my lens. I was looking around and I realized that, you can't capture in the picture, but when I took this picture, there were just people walking up and down the steps, completely ignoring him. This was like a broad daylight, right? In Bucharest in 2012, this guy just sleeping, really rough sleeping on the street. He doesn't even have a sleeping bag or a piece of cardboard. He's just on the cement, just completely abandoned and ignored by everybody there. And I think that the point is that there are people, if you spent any time in Eastern Europe in the 90s, they were all over the place, especially men, especially drunks, especially in the train stations or rough sleeping in the parks. They were everywhere. But like the narrative was sort of this railroad of it's going to get better, freedom, democracy, capitalism, consumerism, it's all going to be good. So yes, there will be some casualties, but in the end, we will all be better off. And this comes to your second question. And here, I really think the best book to read is Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes's book, The Light That Failed. I mean, if you haven't read it, it's a must read. And really what Krastev and Holmes show is that if the ideal was Western democracy and Western capitalism, which it was for every single one of these East European countries, why would you stay and build it in your own country when you could just go and live it in the West and be done, right? And so the key thing is that there was this massive evacuation of Eastern Europe of young, bright, educated, talented people, which the West really benefited from. And the East has really suffered from the loss of. And I think that, when Krastev and Holmes talk about the light that failed, what they're really talking about ultimately is not only the failure of the promise of liberal democracy, but specifically this question of the demographic crisis, like all of these young people. And I think you're absolutely right that the reason why there's been so little political resistance in these countries is because why, if you're young and educated, why stay and suffer when you can just move and live somewhere else and, be free and live the life that you were promised by the narrative of people like Helmut Kohl in 1990, right? So, and I mean, and that consideration is still very much alive in this part of the world, so that the people who have stayed behind and tried to make lives in places like Bulgaria or Serbia or Bosnia, Romania, many of them have just finally, I mean, especially with the pandemic, I think they've just finally given up and said, no, that's it. 30 years is enough. If my country is not going to change, it didn't change in the last 30 years, it's not going to change. And so, yeah, there's very little political will. And I think it exactly feeds into populist parties. It exactly feeds into the more right-wing narrative of nationalism. And what we're going to see, in my prediction, in the next 10 years is an even further shift to these sort of nationalistic narratives as young people flee, anybody who can gets out of the country, and those that stay behind kind of cling more desperately to their kind of national identities in a way to sort of save their countries from, some kind of imagined catastrophe.
Thank you so much for your answers. Are there any further questions from the audience? Please feel free. Jan?
It's just a little question. Thank you very much for the lovely discussion and for this brilliant presentation. I would really love to read your book, but you around the beginning you said that you try really to keep descriptive and factual in order not to provoke people who then would get blind to the facts that you bring up with your book. So I don't want to spoil this effect, but if you if you let yourself provoke into this, what would be what would be your thoughts that are that you had to suppress within this sort of project, and that you still find crucial to understanding? And perhaps you were also saying that you have avoided causal sort of reasoning in your work. So what would be your thought here But of course, you're you're free not to let yourself be provoked by this. Thank you.
Kristen, why don't you go ahead and start on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big can of worms. Let's just put it that way, right? I mean, I think, you know, it really does depend on the scale of the argument, right? And I think that this was something that got discussed a little earlier, is like, what came before, right? And to the extent that there is, for instance, like the economists will argue with us about our data on the length and depth of the transitional recessions, they will often try to say that the data before 1989 is unreliable because we don't actually know what the GDP per capita, for instance, was in these countries, because the way they kept statistics was unreliable. So, and I do think, and I'm deliberately being evasive here. I do think that there are a variety of political narratives that can be placed upon this experience of transition that help make sense of why the JCurve narrative and the disaster capitalist narrative can coexist at the same time for different people, right? And that, you know, there is a kind of understanding, I would say an unspoken understanding, that a certain amount of inequality in society is necessary for innovation, for economic growth, for democracy and liberal freedoms to prevail. That you need to give people incentives to accumulate wealth to themselves and pass that wealth on to the next generation. And that the only way that system really works is if you allow for a certain amount of inequality, right? That's just sort of boiled into the economic, the ideal, and I mean in quotes here, ideal economic system, right? When we talk about Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, the idea that liberal democracy and free market capitalism represent the end state of human development, what they're trying to say is that there's sort of an ideal amount of inequality that's not so extreme that it ends up in a kind of revolution, but that it's not so less that it ends up in stagnation, which is the general feeling of the economies of Eastern Europe, that they were stagnant, right? So there's a way in which I think, from a theoretical point of view, what we're really, and this is why I think I believe that Mitchell and I did the right thing in not trying to go here. There's a discussion to be had ultimately about sort of where is the kind of the sweet spot between egalitarianism and having enough inequality that you spur innovation and you spur economic growth or whatever, right? And that maybe the transition process, because of the creation of the oligarchs in such a very brief period of time, because of the way that the national wealth was really just sort of raped and pillaged by these oligarchs, as well as by some Western corporations, so that the roots of inequality are really fresh in people's memory. Like, I mean, I'm American. I don't remember the Gilded Age. My grandmother doesn't remember the Gilded. I know my country was built on slavery and genocide and vast levels of inequality, but I don't remember that in my lifetime, right? Whereas I think in Eastern Europe, like, people remember, right? They remember very clearly what happened in the 90s in Russia or what happened in Bulgaria. And so there's a kind of like desire to elide this. I think there's a way in which the international financial institutions just sort of assume that there's a kind of sweet spot, and that 30% doing well and 70% doing poorly or the same or poorly is okay. That's actually a pretty good outcome. And I think that what Mitchell and I were trying to avoid doing was saying, really, actually, that's not a very good outcome because 70% is a lot more than 30%. And if you're a utilitarian, if you take a utilitarian point of view and you're thinking about maximizing happiness, this is a terrible outcome, even by the standards of somebody like John Stuart Mill, who is a kind of a hero of liberal economists. We just felt, and I won't say we because I'm speaking out just for me. I just felt as I was kind of like struggling with this, resisting the attempt to make any kind of causal claim or anything, that like just putting the numbers there was enough. And if you're the kind of person who thinks, hey, 70-30 is pretty damn good, then you're going to think that our book is like, okay, yeah, the JCurve narrative was right. And if you're the kind of person who goes, wait, 70-30, really? That's not, wait, what? Then you're going to be like, then you might be able, as a scholar, as an intellectual, as an ordinary person, to sort of say, okay, well, what could have been done differently? How could we have changed this figure? Was it changeable? And especially to come back to Professor Nussberger's point earlier, which is that like the oligarchs really skew this, right? Because they have so much wealth up at the top that like the Gini coefficients and the inequality in this part of the world is catastrophic levels, right? Imposed upon people who are not used to inequality at all, right? So I do think that as scholars of this region, we work on in a very politically tense part of the world. I'm sure all of you understand that, right? And so sometimes the right choice is to just present the facts, just present the data. That's what I would say. But Mitchell, you go ahead.
Yeah, with a couple things. So, I think that's an interesting answer. I'd say, first of all, the reason we don't really talk about causal is because when we did, we got reviewers who were neoliberal economists who attacked us. Right. And they were like, you got to cut out this had absolutely nothing to do with our economic reforms that we put in place. Right. That's a political sensitivity. Right. And so don't blame us for all these things that happened. It was somebody else's fault. Right. So what that means is that basically, from that perspective, if we start saying, oh yeah, this book is like blaming a bunch of economists for killing like 3 million people, right? Okay, then nobody's going to read our book, except maybe somebody who goes to for a lawsuit or something, So on contrary, when we were talking to our colleagues in Georgia, they were saying, well, if you ever criticize anything around here, you get blamed for being pro-Russian. Right. So if you ever say that, oh yeah, people aren't doing as well as they should, it's like, damn Russians. We have that problem a little bit in the United States too, honestly, but it sounds like it's worse in Georgia. And so, so basically, we also didn't necessarily want to get lumped in with Vladimir Putin, right, as sort of like, oh yeah, these guys are promoting the disaster capitalism narrative. They're all, Putinites, And interestingly, that honestly, I think is why we got a really positive review in the American Conservative, which is supporting Russia right now, and also in the Social Europe, right, which is supporting egalitarian, social policies, essentially because we don't, really take one side or the other in that debate, and taking a causal stance probably would have tipped it one way or the other a little bit, because we would have explicitly criticized either communism, so it just makes it worse. But then the other part is, honestly, we just have no way of knowing, right, as social scientists, right? It's like, I look at that chart of comparing the post-communist countries in Europe to Vietnam and China, and you wonder, and you have to look at that and think, well, maybe they screwed up. Maybe Chinese economists are way better than our economists, right? That thought often occurs to me. Does it occur to you? Maybe Vietnamese economists are better at strategic planning than our economists. That's what I think about, honestly. right? Because they were able to engineer a much better transition, right, than our Nobel Prize winning economists in the West. And frankly, I think the main impact of our book is forcing a discussion in development economics about what the hell they did wrong, right? Not that we know that everything was their fault, because it probably wasn't, right? But you can't look at that and say, oh yeah, we did a great job, you know? No, they didn't do a great job. And so somebody is going to have to come to account for that, I think. But there's also another point of view, which we got very much from our neoliberal, colleagues, which is that, maybe communism created this false equality, right? Maybe Tajikistan isn't equal to Latvia, right? Maybe one of them is a developing country and always will be, and one of them is a developed country and belongs in the European Union. Maybe communism was sort of suppressing the natural way of order of human society, right? And was making us seem like Tajikistan is like the same as Latvia, right? Or similar to Latvia, right? And so now what's happened is that, that communism was so out of line with the natural order of things that now everything's gone back to the way it should, right? And a bunch of countries have become terrible third world countries to live in, and other countries have gone back to more European standards of living, right? I mean, or some version of that. Maybe that's a little rough way to put it, but that communism screwed up the economy so much that they had to have this deep recession, and now maybe things will be better. I mean, there are various variants of these arguments, and honestly, we just didn't. It's hard to know. Honestly, it's like it would be very, very hard to know. I think people will debate it out. I think that they'll look at this and try to take account of it over time, but it would take a lot more research, honestly, a lot of different type of research, causal research, a lot of papers, some of which are being written, to sort that out, I guess is the question. So it was a judgment call. I mean, I suppose we could have written this for Zed Books, or for we could have written this for what is that left-wing publishing house, Pluto Press, or those places, and we say, look, neoliberalism did all this. This is how bad neoliberalism is. And I think part of it is we didn't want to, but also part of it is that we really couldn't say. We're not 100% sure. Honestly.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful wrap up and also view ahead in a way. And as time is running out already, let me thank you so much for being with us tonight and for engaging in this wonderful discussion. And I'm look forward to sort of following up also on how your book, what discussions it may provoke in the future. And we're very happy to have had you here tonight, Mr. Orenstein and Kristen Ghodsee.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to be with you all.
Great pleasure to be here. I hope everyone is safe and healthy and have wonderful holidays coming up in the future.